Hey everybody, Miss Russell here with your first lecture of the school year. We're going to start out today and our discussion of photography with the history of photography. I think it's important to study the history of photography so we know where photography started, where it is now, and where it's going. Plus, it's something that I find super fascinating, and I think that it helps kind of inform us on the roots of photography and how it has affected photography today. So the title of today's presentation is called Writing with Light because, fun fact, photography literally means writing with light. Photo meaning light, graphy meaning writing, smush them together, writing with light, because that's really what photography is, capturing an image using light. So we're going to jump right into it, starting way back 2,500 years ago with the Camera Obscura. Now, the Camera Obscura is something that I teach about every year, and it's something that students still struggle to grasp, to wrap their heads around. It's still something that if I hadn't seen it in person, it's hard to grasp and to wrap our heads around. But essentially, in its simplest form, a Camera Obscura is an optical device, right? Optics meaning eye. So it's an optical device, and what it is you can take a room, a box, any size, right? Of just you need four walls, a roof and a floor, right? Okay, so an enclosed box of some kind, and in that enclosed box or room, every single source of light needs to be blocked, right? Windows blocked with black paper, lights turned off. No light can enter the room except for a small opening, right? We call it a pinhole, and light will enter into that pinhole, and whatever is outside, right? You'll notice in this PowerPoint image, you'll notice like there's over to the left, like a tower of some kind, a bush, like, a landscape of some kind. So whatever is outside, that image will then the light will travel through the pinhole, and then that image will be projected, flipped upside down on the opposite wall. I know that it sounds like magic, right? And we're like, Miss Russell, I don't know if this is real, but it is, I promise you. If our classroom, if you were here with me, and our photography classroom had an outside wall that had sunlight that would come in, I've seen many photography teachers do this. They will turn their entire classroom into a camera obscura, block out all the light, put black paper on all the windows, and then they will just allow, like through a window, like a teeny pinhole of light to enter. And then you can see that image, like I said, flipped and then projected onto the opposite wall. Again, it's like a phenomenon, right? Like an optical phenomenon. But it's real. It happens. You can do it in something, like I said, as big as a classroom. You can do it with a small box. All you need is to get rid of any source of light except for that pinhole, and then it will project the image that is being captured by the pinhole onto the opposite wall. Now, if you think about the practical applications of this, there are many. The first people to record this camera, what they call the camera obscura effect, the first people to record it, it was over 2,500 years ago in 500 BC. The Chinese were the first to record it. Now, we don't know if they used the camera obscura effect for any practical application, but we can look at the writings from 2,500 years ago and realize that people kind of noted that it happened, right? But fast forward to the Renaissance, right? Like 1500s, 1600s, artists, they use the camera obscura for practical purposes. Okay, Miss Russell, what does that mean? Okay, so I like to use this example, and when I first started teaching, this example resonated with students more. They're like, oh yeah, I know what she's talking about. But I realized the longer I teach and the older I get and the younger my students get, they didn't use projectors in their classrooms like we did. Like you guys use the projectors that project a computer image. But back when I was a kid, we had these glass boxes. Actually, it was like a metal box with a glass top. And our teacher would wheel it around and put it in the center of the classroom. And she would take a transparency, which is like a see-through piece of paper. It looks something like this. But then it would have an image on it or writing on it, okay? And she would lay that image, he or she would lay that image on the glass screen of our projector, and then that image would be projected onto the opposite wall, and then we as students could read, whether it was text or we could see the image. And that was That's what all of our teachers used when I was a kid. We didn't have computers with projectors when I was growing up in the dark ages. And so that's kind of what I imagine these artists use these camera obscura, what they would use these camera obscuras for. They would have, like, at this point, camera obscuras were smaller, and they would set up their little still life image, with some fruit and a like jug of water and a vase with flowers or something. And they would position it just so within the camera obscura. And again, the whole camera obscura was no light would enter into it, but except for that pinhole of light. And then that image, they would reveal the pinhole, and then that image would be projected on the opposite wall upside down. And they would take their canvas and place it on that opposite wall and use that projected image to kind of sketch or trace, like basic outlines of shapes. It would help them with things like perspective, like the size of one object in relation to another object. So they used this projected image to help them with their artwork, and to help them like kind of trace some rough shapes out. And like I said, and figure out perspective. I did the same thing as a kid, right? Like with the projector, I would put my little paper up on the wall and trace it. And so that's kind of how I imagine these Renaissance artists would use the camera obscura in their artwork. Again, it's that first practical application of the camera obscura. Fast forward a little bit of time, and the camera obscura was revolutionized when a man named Cardano added a glass lens into the camera obscura. So remember, before, the camera obscura would just maintain things like shape and form and perspective. But with the introduction of the glass lens, because the glass lens is very sharp, very crisp, and it maintains things like detail. So now, instead of just perspective and shape, we get things like the folds of, if you notice this picture, a very famous painting by Jan Vermeer, the folds of the fabric on her head, right? Her eyelashes, the strokes of her eyebrows. So now this glass lens helps maintain things like this detail, and artists are able to use it even more in their artwork. And so this led to greater experimentation and more practical applications of the camera obscura. We see this in another famous photo, fast forwarding a little much, another famous painting. We see, like I said, that perspective. Notice the buildings in front are much larger than the ones in back. To us, that's like, well, duh. Things that are closer to you appear bigger than things in the background. But this was something that artists had to figure out over time. You notice the detail of the home, of the buildings, of the clouds, right? People were stunned when they saw artwork from someone like Jan Vermeer, who we know used the camera obscura in his art. They were stunned by the lifelike detail, because up until this time, paintings weren't as lifelike as they are today. Okay, so fast forward a little bit, Mrs. Russell, what does this have to do with photography? Okay, well, by the early 1700s, the camera obscura had all the basic functions of a camera today, right? Box, a glass lens in it, light would enter, it would create an image. Okay, so all the major components that we have of our cameras today. So the camera obscura is kind of the forefather of the camera. Here's the problem. What happens when the light in the camera obscura turns off? The image disappears, right? So the question became, so we have this amazing device that can create images, but once the light turns off, that image disappears, it goes away. So the question is, how do we make images permanent? How do we make the images stay once the light is gone? And that kind of becomes the question, and that mystery remains unsolved for 120 years. So let's talk about the quest to make that image permanent, okay? In 1727, a German professor by the name of Johann Heinrich Schulze, he's German, like I said, he made an observation in his experiments that silver salts, which was literally a combination of silver and salt, would darken when they were exposed to light. So I imagine kind of this rock, right? This like salty, silvery looking rock. And when it would go out into the sunlight, he noticed that it would darken to like a black. He didn't do anything with it. He just kind of noted it in his journal. So that was kind of the first step. We're like, silver salts. Silver salts react to light. Okay, noted. Let's move forward in history. By 1800, a man by the name of Thomas Wedgwood, he was English, he was a chemist. He started using these silver salts because of Schulze's observations. He knew that silver salts darkened when exposed to light. So he took it a step further. He would take pieces of leather, like flat pieces of leather, and he would make what he called sun pictures. So he would take his flat pieces of leather, he would kind of paint it with this silver salt solution, right? Like kind of ground it down and made it a paste, and then he would paint it across these flat pieces of leather. And then he would lay leaves on top of the leather and take it out into the sunlight and allow it to be exposed to the sun. And he would leave it out there for hours at a time. And then he'd bring it back into his lab. I imagine him like with a scientific lab because he was a chemist. He'd bring it back into the lab and he would take off the leaves. And what do you think he noticed underneath? He would notice the outlines of the leaves, right? Because all the leather around the leaves that was exposed to the sun would darken, but then the leather that was covered by the leaves, it would stay light. And so he would take off the leaves and he would have these beautiful outlines of leaves. And he called them sun pictures. But the problem was that once he removed the leaves, eventually those outlines, once those were exposed to light, the outlines or the shapes of the leaves, those would eventually go black too. Okay, so then his sun pictures would disappear. So again, the question was, how do we make images permanent? Okay, and then a breakthrough occurs. In 1826, a man by the name of Joseph Nietzsche, he was French, which is why that name is very hard to pronounce. A man by the name of Joseph Nietzsche, he took a silver salt solution, okay, and it was called bitumen. And he took a piece of metal, a flat piece of metal. It was a specific type of metal called pewter. And he took that pewter and he would paint it with the silver salt, with the bitumen. And he stuck it into a camera obscura. And he pointed his camera out the window. And he took his first photo. The first exposure was anywhere, I've heard many different figures. But we've heard anywhere from like 4 to 8 to 10 hours that he pointed his camera out the window. He's combining the camera obscura and he's combining silver salts. Okay, he's the first one to successfully do this. He pointed it out the window. He took the pewter plate after about 8 hours. He took the pewter plate out of the camera and he placed it into a solution made with lavender oil. And the lavender oil, what we call fixed the image. Fixed means makes it permanent. So lavender oil becomes the first fixer in photography. Okay, so he combined everything. He combined the camera obscura, he combined the silver salts, he put them together, he made an image. And the image, unlike Wedgwood's sun pictures that eventually would just darken to black, because he placed it into a fixer, because he placed it into lavender oil, which he discovered was a great fixer, the image becomes permanent. And we have the very first photograph ever taken in 1826. Are you all ready to see it? It's amazing and revolutionary. Ta-da! Now, obviously, with our 2020 eyeballs, this picture's like womp womp, right? Like, how is this? And I'm moving my webcam around so you can see the photo, all parts of the photo. But to us, it's like, what's so exciting about this photograph? But if you think about it in that context, that this is the very first photograph ever taken, it kind of becomes a little amazing, right? And it's called View from the Window at Le Gras, France. It was literally the view from his studio window. But if you look at it closely, because at first it kind of just looks like this dark mass of like, what's going on here? But if you look at it closely, you can tell that it's from like, a second or third story window. You can see roof lines. You can see way back in the distance, like a steeple, maybe like a church steeple. You can see a tree over there off to the left. And so he is like so jazzed, right? Because he's created the first image. He has figured out how to make images permanent. He has combined the camera, the silver salt, and found a fixer, and now he's created the world's first photograph, okay? Now, Nietzsche, unfortunately, died soon after this. So he didn't get all the fame that he deserved. His partner,